court meets today pursuant to Article 67 of the statute to deliver its advisory opinion on the request submitted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the question of the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Jerusalem.
That's the voice of Justice Nawaf Salam, the president of the International Court of Justice in The Hague last week, reading out the U.S. World Court's legal opinion on Israeli policies in the West Bank and East Jerusalem these past 57 years, or what the UN and many, including Canada, consider the occupied Palestinian territories. 2 years ago, the UN General Assembly asked the World Court to study the issue of Israel's presence in the area, which it captured from Jordan during the 1967 Six-Day War in self-defense after being attacked first. It's the first time the UN court has ruled so broadly on this topic. The dozen judges said the court found Israel turned its once legal military occupation into a civilian one by making Israeli law apply in some parts and by appointing an Israeli cabinet minister in charge of the area. In short, de facto annexing the land. It wants Israel to withdraw, to pay untold sums to the Palestinians as compensation, and talks about how Israel has stolen Palestinian natural resources, kicked Palestinians off their land either by force or by intimidation and fear, treats Palestinians as non-citizens, and the court says it's all a form of illegal racial segregation, if not apartheid. Israel was condemned for building illegal settlements that let hundreds of thousands of Israelis move in, which is an illegal transfer of population. Supporters of Palestinian rights say the ruling's important because it puts into writing what they've been saying for years. But critics say the whole court is biased against Israel.
It will only serve as a reward for Hamas. It will push the Palestinian Authority further away from negotiations that are necessary in order to achieve the peace, of course, that we all seek and yearn, and it will pour more fuel on the global anti-Semitic fire, including in Canada and elsewhere around the world.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Tuesday, July 23rd, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News.
I can't date women right now because I'm too busy calling myself a piece of shit.
I had a dysfunctional Jewish mother and I had a dysfunctional Native mother.
I had 25 full years of utter struggle and failure.
I started to realize the absurdity of my inability to let go of this monster of guilt.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Hi, I'm Ralph Benrig. I'm the host of Not That Kind of Rabbi, where we look at people's spiritual journeys and take a little time for their self-reflection, and maybe yours. You can get it all at the cjn.ca/NTKR or wherever you get your podcasts.
2 years ago, Canada tried to stop the UN from even sending this request for a legal opinion to the World Court and voted against the resolution at the time. Canada says the court's meddling in the Middle East's thorniest issue would have made negotiations to bring about a lasting peace even tougher. But now that the legal opinion is out, Canada says only that it, quote, has taken note of it, unquote, and has said nothing further. The ruling came just days before Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, landed in Washington, D.C., where he's set to meet outgoing U.S. President Joe Biden, and he'll speak to Congress on Wednesday. Will the ICJ opinion weigh on that visit? We've got some answers. Joining me now is Arsen Ostrovsky, a human rights lawyer and CEO of the Israeli NGO called the International Legal Forum. It's a network of 4,000 lawyers, including some right here in Canada, who fight Israel's cases through lawsuits in the courts. Ostrovsky's just been in Canada for a week, but he's normally based in Tel Aviv. And Ben Moraine is here too. He's executive director of the New Israel Fund of Canada, which financially supports projects and groups in Israel fighting for equal rights and democracy, including for women, immigrants, non-Orthodox Jews, and the Palestinians. Welcome to the CJN Daily to both of you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
But let's first understand for our listeners, in brief, what did the court rule?
The ruling of the ICJ, it's an advisory opinion, so it's not legally binding. And it says a couple things. It basically says, first, that occupations are legal. It's like legal for one country to militarily occupy a place after a conflict. And that may come as a surprise to many, say, pro-Palestinian supporters. What it says, however, is the sort of plain English reading of international law, that you are not allowed two things. You're not allowed to move your own population into that territory. That's illegal. And the other part is that occupational rule must be military, because civilian rule is just sort of plainly anti-democratic. The principle is that the voters of one country should not be making all the decisions of the citizens or residents of another place. And recently, especially, this extremist Israeli government quietly moved practical day-to-day governance of all the pieces of the occupied territories under Israeli control under a civilian ruler, Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who's a settler leader himself. But the ICJ opinion, lastly, says also what Israeli progressives and groups like the New Israel Fund and our funded partners in Israel have been saying for decades, that it's not too late. It is possible to wind this back if we end the settlement enterprise.
Arsen, they also, if you want to add anything, they also use some words such as segregation, racial segregation. What are some of the highlights for you that our listeners need to know?
Well, I'd say it's more quite a few lowlights, not highlights from our perspective. And I would add that the court, in addition to what Ben said, it ruled on a couple of other things, including, for example, that Jerusalem, or at least part thereof, is occupied. Jerusalem, of course, is our undivisible capital. They also suggested that Gaza itself was occupied. Of course, that is not correct, given that Israel moved out of Gaza entirely in 2005, and they also, perhaps most absurdly, called for Israel to provide reparations, which is probably one of the more absurd aspects of it. But I think we also need to put this whole process in context, because it didn't happen in a vacuum. We have to remember, and as Ben said, that this is an advisory opinion and it's non-binding. However, for the resolution to the opinion was provided by the UN General Assembly, which is, of course, a political body. The presiding judge himself that presided over the reading of the verdict is from Lebanon, country controlled by Hezbollah, and that does not even recognize Israel's right to exist. Who himself, before being appointed to the court, had already accused Israel of various war crimes, human rights violations, and so on. In any reasonable Western democracy, this judge would have recused himself. But at the end of the day, honestly, reading through the opinion, it beggars belief on a lot of levels. This is, from our perspective, this is a legally baseless and entirely politically motivated decision of the court that is masquerading itself essentially as a legal opinion, but devoid of any sound legal reasoning.
I understand that you both say it's non-binding. Did I read correctly, though, that it said that it behooves member states to continue to make sure that they are not helping the Israelis do what they are accused of doing in this ruling? So what does that mean? In other words, does Canada now have to do anything?
Well, it's an advisory opinion in that sense. So it's not binding. It's not an order. In that sense, at the end of the day, every country, including Canada, every democracy, is free to make their own sovereign decisions in terms of bilateral relations, in terms of what to do and what not to do.
I mean, Canada hasn't said anything except we note this, we took note of this.
One thing that the court virtually made no reference to, the hostages. We still have 120 hostages being held captive in Gaza, including, by the way, I should add that 8 Canadian nationals were murdered during the massacre, one of whom Yehudit Weinstein, her body is still being held captive. We also had, of course, as you know, Vivian Silva, and I can see her picture behind over Ben's shoulder, was murdered as well, who was obviously, a passionate, courageous peace activist. So we have to remember that those who hate us, whether in the Hamas or those in some of the elements of the Palestinian Authority, they don't care if we're left-wing, right-wing, pro-two-state, anti-two-state solution. They hate us for one reason, because we're Jews. Simple as that.
The truth about this ruling, short of the, what does it actually say? This ruling says, on the one hand, that the rain is wet. This is an opinion that Canada already has, the US already has, the UK already has, France already has. Nobody in the world, no country, none of Israel's strongest, deepest allies, not even necessarily a majority of the Israeli public, believe the settlement enterprise is legal, much less right. The plain English reading of international law is very, very clear. In fact, in 1967, it was Ted Marin was the Knesset legal advisor. The Knesset legal advisor in 1967 said we can't build settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, and Israel has been violating their own internal legal advice ever since. there's no seriously viable argument for legally building settlements. Only the settlement movement and their advocates believe this. So Israeli society is bound up in a deep debate over to what extent this settlement or that settlement block could be kept in a compromise. But nobody believes that they began as legal, or very, very few. There's no base for this view outside a few hardline Israeli views and their advocates abroad. So on the other hand, it's consequential. It's a big deal that the question kind of finally began rising in the highest put on the agenda. And it began being put on the agenda long before October 7th. This is one of the underlying fault lines of the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not like a recent product of, say, what is actually real in the world, which is some dogpiling on Israel in the international forums. But actually, it's the chickens have come home to roost. We have been warning, Israelis have been warning, New Israel Funds, you name it, Peace Now, these groups, even major American Jewish organizations and some Canadian Jewish organizations in the mainstream have been warning about this is coming for us unless we end the settlement enterprise and unless we bring a two-state solution. It's a more complicated question how to get to that two-state solution.
I know that the New Israel Fund has a group that it supports in Israel, which is a watchdog on what this report says is happening in the territories, and the police and military do nothing. So what do you know about this, and how does this report highlight this work you've been doing?
The New Israel Fund is one of the largest supporters of Israeli human rights NGOs. So these are Israeli groups, Israelis, they've served in the military, they live there, they vote there, who are determined to implementing international law. They believe in it. They believe that's what's best for the safety and the security of Israel and Israelis. Groups like Yesh Din, Breaking the Silence, Hamoked, and others count, catalog, and detail, and they're responsible for holding a mirror up to Israeli society of this is what the settlement movement inside and outside the Israeli government is doing, which includes the expansion of settlements, the appropriation of land from Palestinian villages and individual owners, rampant settler violence, and has led to dozens of communities leaving Palestinian communities, like farming communities, rural communities, small villages, who in recent years have left because the settler violence is so severe. Daily attacks, daily intimidation, burning cars, killing animals, killing people sometimes. And the Israeli government has just let it go because its closest allies are the settler parties who don't care about international law at all. They believe in the Bible, and they believe that the land is theirs. So all of this stuff about the ICJ, they don't care. And you see them in the media just calling it anti-Semitic and dismissing it. And what's really good to see is that last year during the pro-democracy protest, you saw from the main stage of those democracy protests rightly saying that this government is messianist. It doesn't care what the world thinks, to the point that they'll light the region on fire.
Okay, I'm going to bring Arsen in. What does the International Legal Forum think is the serious issue that this ICJ report raises?
I'll touch on in a second if I can just respond to a few things. Obviously, Ben touched on quite a few issues there. I mean, first of all, I don't think there's anything wrong in believing in the Bible. We are, of course, a people of the book. We're also a people of the law itself as well. And the two of those are not mutually exclusive. I think irrespective of where one stands on the status of Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, as some might call it, and there also has to be, first and foremost, a recognition that the Jewish people also have an inextricable connection, a historical, legal, and biblical connection to these territories as well, including Jerusalem, which likewise the court ruled is occupied territory. Simply put, we cannot be occupiers on our own land, and the Jewish people, the state of Israel, has just as much, I would argue, if not even more, connection to these territories. At the end of the day, however, a peaceful outcome will only come by way of direct negotiations between the parties. So it's very good to talk about a two-state solution, but you can't talk about it in a vacuum. And the reality is that, I don't have to go through a historical lesson, that time and time again over the decades, Israel has offered the Palestinian statehood. Camp David, 2000, 2001, with Ehud Olmert, take your pick, through even Netanyahu, 2009 and 10, offered a settlement freeze, but nothing. The one constant, irrespective of which kind of government Israel has been in power, it has been Palestinian terror and intransigence. And that is the ultimate root cause of the situation that we're seeing today. But the reality is there will be no advancement on a peaceful outcome as long as as long as the Palestinians believe that they can avoid negotiations, avoid compromise, the kind that is necessary, including the kind that was envisaged within the Oslo Accords framework itself, if they can assume that they can just sit and wait for the international courts to do their job for them, when in reality they're not doing their job for them, that they're pushing peace further away by politicizing by politicizing international law and essentially engaging in a form of lawfare on behalf of the Palestinians. That will only push the parties further away, regrettably. Whereas the world can can use the settlements as a scapegoat as much as they want, but the reality is the real root cause is the ongoing terror, not only by Hamas but by the supporters and I would say even to some extent collaborators within the Palestinian Authority.
There's been more than one ruling by the ICJ, by the ICC for the last 20 years. I mean, this isn't the first, it's not going to be the last, right? We're still waiting for the genocide in Gaza one. We got the interim report, we got the emergency one. Where does this latest ICJ ruling on the territories fit into the whole history? I mean, because there was one on the wall, which they found illegal 20 years ago. So how many more of them are there out there? And where does this fit, and how significant is this one?
Although I don't have the full history of every single footnote through the past, decades of their rulings, this remains consistent with their rulings, which they say, I think it's actually not worth the hyperbolic responses from some in the Jewish community, because these are rulings against not Israel, but the settlement movement. Again, go back to the one about the wall. It said you can build a wall, you just can't build it on Palestinian land. Same with this one. It doesn't say that Israel can't be a Jewish state. It doesn't say that that Israel doesn't have important claims in the conflict. It doesn't say that that there isn't a negotiated potential solution to the conflict, and it doesn't say that Hamas is great. What it says is you can have an occupation, but you can't move your people onto there. That is a very plain bedrock of international law, and all the views about you can read the law this way, those are rather fringe views. Very, 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 very few people in the entire world believe that those are true. So this is actually consistent. And I think the ICJ is responsible for maintaining some consistency, because people are looking at this ruling. Russia's looking at this ruling, so how can it apply to Ukraine? China's looking at this ruling, to how can it apply to this place and that place? I think people should zoom out a little bit and see the wider context of not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the vying claims on both sides. We need to look at where we are in the world at this moment, as the world order established, after World War II, is undergoing increasing stress. Particularly far-right populist and liberalist leaders look to take a bite out of the country next door. And I think we need to look at the Israeli right in that same way. They're looking to take a bite out of the territories, if not the whole thing. And there are other countries that also want to take a bite out of lands that they think are historically theirs. They have a long historical claim to. They can come up with a bending over backwards legal interpretation to figure out some footnote in international law that they also think legitimizes that they just want to take it with brute force. And they want to move their people there and they want its resources. We have to see this ruling in the place of the wider world at the moment. And that's really, really critical to understand.
Yeah, look, when you ask the question, how many more cases like this perhaps we can expect, I can tell you we can probably expect a flood of these kinds of cases, but we can expect that because the international courts continue to engage on behalf of the Palestinians, essentially as a form of lawfare and advocacy, or agents on their behalf. And this is not hyperbolic. What we're seeing is a slow erosion of the international legal order. We saw that with the ICC, where not only is there no substance, but the criminal court prosecutor had the audacity to place someone like the Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Israel along the same level as Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, and Mohammed Deif, the terrorist leaders of the bloodthirsty terrorist group Hamas, which initiated the massacre of October 7th. So I think what we're seeing also is in part a trend where courts as these refuse to distinguish between democratic, liberal democracies like the State of Israel and terrorist groups like Hamas. And I would add one more thing, that this does have a very real consequence, not just for Canada, but for every Western democracy, because when courts politicize these kinds of decisions and cases. It places Canadian forces at risk. It means that someone like North Korea, China, Russia can easily make a claim against another democracy. The point of the matter is, no one is saying Israel's above the rule of law. We're not. The issue at heart here is that Israel has been systematically denied equality before the law, and none more so at the UN and the International Court of Justice, as we have seen this year.
So Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu, is heading to Washington as we're speaking. Is Bibi's trip risky? Does he risk being actually arrested like Slobodan Milosevic was and thrown in Scheveningen prison?
No, he doesn't. First of all, there's no arrest warrant out on him yet. The court is still deliberating that. He is also in the United States, which is a friendly democracy and which itself is not a signatory to the ICC, because the United States, like the State of Israel, understood very early on the dangers of this kind of court that will only affect our country's right to sovereignty, self-defense. So hence the United States, like Israel, did not sign on to the Rome Statute, so there is no risk of that. And quite frankly, I think irrespective of where one stands on the conflict, I think it is a good thing, and we should be applauding the fact that the Prime Minister of Israel is coming to the United States, that he is speaking to Congress, that this is an invite, by the way, from both parties. In Israel, the fact of the matter is the United States is our strongest ally, and that is something always worth supporting, pursuing, and strengthening.
Thank you so much to Arsen Ostrovsky and Ben Moraine for being with us on the CJN Daily.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily. To read the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion for yourselves, just go to the link in our show notes. By the way, that ruling wasn't unanimous. The Ugandan judge and 3 of her colleagues dissented. They refused to sign parts of the ruling, and she, in particular, strongly criticized it. The ICJ has issued 5 important rulings on Israel-Palestine in the last 20 years, and there are more to come. On the docket is a case of Palestine suing the U.S. for moving its embassy to Jerusalem, and we're still waiting for the final ruling on the genocide in Gaza case brought by South Africa. Now, our executive producer of the CJN Daily, Michael Freeman, was out reporting this weekend in Niagara Falls, where there was a pro-Palestinian cross-border rally on Sunday. And as he found out, and you'll hear in a moment, the leaders of that protest declared the ICJ ruling as another victory. As I said, Michael is our executive producer. The Daily is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Thanks for listening, and here's that clip.
Thirdly, the imperial and colonial project of the illegitimate and rogue, and now even illegal, according to the International Court of Justice, State of Israel, relies on the illusion...
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.